It begins with recognizing the deep inequities that live among us. By making visible the invisible and bridging these vast divides, it sparks determination, not pity. It demands challenging the status quo, the courage to take paths less traveled, and the willingness to immerse in the shared truths of our vulnerabilities. It makes philanthropy work for communities, not for privilege. It calls for nurturing trust and radical kindness, the empathy to explore possibilities, and the humility to accept these in our oneness. It's the fierce ambition to be uncompromising, to satiate the hunger for learning, and to have the audacity to amplify the most vulnerable of voices. It requires perseverance, intelligence, and gusto, true moral courage for sustenance. It inspires leadership that adjusts the sails to catch the wind, to imagine possibilities in pursuit of a higher purpose, bigger than ourselves, but that together is surmountable. Dasra, it combines the power of the mind and the courage of the heart to tackle large-scale inequities, building an India that we all deserve, thriving with dignity and equity.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Dasra Philanthropy Week. We are glad to have you all join us today. Dasra Philanthropy Week is currently in its 14th edition, and it has always stood as a platform to bring together diverse stakeholders and voices from the development ecosystem to convene, converse, and continue sustained action towards the quest for 1 billion Indians to thrive with dignity and equity. We're delighted to share that this edition is hosting 40 plus sessions across diverse themes, hear voices of 100 plus thought leaders, and have more than 2,000 plus attendees tune in for both our in-person and virtual events. This is the most extensive spread of programming we've ever had at DPW, and are excited for a lineup of thought-provoking sessions we have lined up for you today. Welcome to the session, Transforming Grant Making, Investing in a Stronger and More Resilient NGO Sector. This session is being held in partnership with Bridgespan, and I'm pleased to now hand it over to Shashank from Bridgespan. Over to you, Shashank.
Thanks, Etna, and welcome everyone to Transforming Grant Making, Investing in a Stronger and More Resilient Social Sector. This is the third edition of DPW, where PWIT India Pay What It Takes India initiative is presenting the key findings and learnings that we are having while working with the sector. And we are extremely thankful to Dasra for giving us this platform, and a very big thank you for all of you making time and having this conversation with us. 3 years back, when we started on this journey, the motivation was a desire to, like a question on how can we make our work as a sector better, a desire to be better, a desire to be more effective. That was what was driving us when we started Pay What It Takes India initiative. And the learnings have been amazing over the last 3 years. There's evidence that unless we are investing in institution building, the wicked problems that all of us are trying to solve will not be solved in sustainable manner. There is encouragement in our interactions with the stakeholders in the sector. We started with looking at the scope and the span of the problem, and it was very dire. But as we have worked along with other stakeholders in the sector, there have been so many encouraging stories, so many champions who have come forward, have shared their learnings, have shared their approaches, and have continued to evolve their practices as well. This makes us very, very optimistic about what lies ahead for us as a sector, as nonprofits, and as Pay What It Takes India initiative. Today in this session, what we want to do is share some of the learnings we have had by interacting deeply with many champions across corporate social responsibility, philanthropy, both domestic and global philanthropic organizations, and high net worth individuals. We also have a very power-packed panel of such champions who have been drivers of this change, who have been committed towards building a stronger and more resilient nonprofits, not for any other reason, but because that drives impact, that helps them achieve the impact objectives that they have set for themselves. Uh, I'll quickly move to a brief introduction of Pay What It Takes. So Aditi, next slide. So as I said, we started, this is the third year of the initiative. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative. We have had more than 1,000 interactions with different stakeholders over the last 2.5 years. We are working with funders, we are working with intermediaries, and we are working with nonprofits. The idea is to create a movement, a self-driven movement which can continue to bring about positive change, which leads to a more effective, a more impact-oriented social sector. Next slide. So there are enough researches, independent studies now in India and globally, which prove that supporting true cost helps amplify the impact potential of nonprofits. When we are talking about true cost, we are talking about costs and investments beyond program funding. We are talking about core costs, which are non-programmatic costs, sometimes called overheads, admin cost, indirect cost, but are vital, very critical for an organization to deliver the programs. They include organizational development investments, and they include funding for reserves, which are critical for tiding over any kind of external shocks. So there have been, as I said, multiple studies. So there has been a Center for Effective Philanthropy study in US and globally of 277 nonprofits who received unrestricted multi-year grants, where the respondents, 83% of respondents said that these grants have really strengthened the organization's ability to achieve the mission. The respondents invested them in building capabilities, in innovating, in building reserves. Our own study of nonprofits in India suggests that those nonprofits which invest in organization development grew 2x, twice as fast as those that were not investing in organization development. Atma, one of the leading capacity building service provider in India, conducted a similar impact study for 85 of their nonprofits. And findings were that their portfolio of 85 nonprofits on an average increased 4 times the number of stakeholders that they were serving. And similarly, when we look at the study of the Ford Build program's impact, a similar results comes out that 83% of nonprofits supported by the Build program were more financially resilient by the end of the initiative. It's also very clear from the evidence that is available now is that when nonprofits are given the authority, the power, when funders cede that power of deciding how to use money, nonprofits are intentional in their use of such money, unrestricted funds, to amplify the programmatic impact as well as strengthen the organization. Hence, it's critical to move away as a sector from the scarcity mindset that we deliberately put nonprofits in, and move towards a scenario where nonprofits and leaders who are closer to the community, they can define and decide how to best use the money in the service of the community that they all want to serve. Next slide. At the same time, the situation is not all rosy. Our research also showed the severity of the problem. the span and the widespreadness of the problem. 83% of nonprofits in our research find it challenging to recover core costs from their program funders. So even if they get unrestricted funding, they end up using it to run their programs. 54% of nonprofits in September 2020, before COVID pandemic had taken its full effect, had less than 3 months of reserve. Only 18% of nonprofits stated that they were investing adequately. And when we talk about nonprofits which are more proximate, which are closer to the community or have leaders coming from more marginalized sections of the community, they were more affected by this problem. So 70% of Dalit, Bahujan and Adivasi-led nonprofits never had an operating surplus in the preceding 3 years of the research. Similarly, what we found was that nonprofits which were headquartered in non-urban areas or nonprofits which were being led by Dalit, Bahujan and Adivasi leaders, more such nonprofits were financially vulnerable in terms of the months of reserves that they were carrying. Hence, it's important for us to recognize and continue to work on this problem and bring together funders, bring together nonprofits, and have this conversation again and again and again. Moving to the next slide. So we have developed 5 principles learning from the sector. There are 5 funder nonprofit relationship oriented principles that come out to support the delivery of greater impact and growth. The first one is developing multi-year funder NGO partnership. It's important not just for the nonprofit because it gives them higher visibility, but also for the funder. It's important to pay a fair share of core cost, invest in NGOs, organization development, and build financial resilience. At the same time, it's very important for the funders to embed a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens in grant making. Without being intentional about it, it's one of those areas which can easily be overlooked and can create a society which is not fair, inequitable, and where we are seeing a section, a vital section of our society falling behind. Next slide. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague Aditi to share the insights of our conversations with some of the champions.
Great, thank you, Shashank. So over the past few weeks, we engaged deeply with about 15 funders to understand how they are practicing these principles to make their grant making more supportive. And there were certain common learnings for us. Interestingly, what we observed was that this is not a step, but rather a journey that funders engage on, along with the support of the various stakeholders who they work with. And we also found that since funders are at different starting points on this journey, they do follow multiple pathways on how these principles get translated in their practices. And to an extent, this is also influenced by the context that they operate in. And more importantly, what we learned is that funders do recognize the importance of continuously learning, iterating, and evolving to move forward on this journey. So moving to the next slide. So while funders, circumstances, their influences and values do steer their grant making decisions and practices in ways that are very unique, what came out interestingly was that there are certain fundamental values that shape effective grant making practices. So firstly, both the funders and nonprofits demonstrate shared values in terms of having a common interest in achieving sustainable impact. There is also an intention to build more meaningful and purpose-driven partnerships to really unlock the real value for the communities that they serve. And another important value that got highlighted was the willingness to learn from each other. And this stems essentially from approaching their work with humility and remaining open to continuously learning on this journey. And lastly, we also observed that there's a focus on creating channels for open and transparent communication, which really helps funders perceiving NGOs as partners and engaging them in discussions about their needs, helping build mutual trust along the way. So these values manifest in different forms and lead funders to take different pathways of adopting the pay what it takes principles. And while each principle have specific benefits attached to them, which we'll be going over in the subsequent slides, at a broader level, adopting these values and principles have led to myriad benefits for the funders, such as creating more effective channels of how they're able to achieve social impact, reducing their focus from more transactional activities to really leveraging their strength on strategic aspects of how to create impact. And more importantly, trying to help drive more equitable benefits through their grant making. So I think as non-profit leaders and funders, it becomes imperative for us to really reflect back and see if we are demonstrating each of these values in our relationships and how we can further strengthen these in the grant making and the programs that we deliver. So through this research, we try to identify what the journey looks like across these 5 principles and what have been the benefits for both funders and their partners, as well as see what are the different pathways that each of these funders take across these principles. So when funders enter into multi-year partnerships, we know that it's not only beneficial for their NGO partners in terms of creating better and more thoughtful programs to solve the most complex social problems, but at the same time, it leads to increased trust between the funder and the NGO that really helps them maximize the impact and also helps simplify grant-making processes for the funders. So we do see different pathways that emanate from this. But for example, ASK Foundation takes a very long-term approach to driving sustainable impact for its communities. And to that effect, they adopted a multi-year partnership approach where they try to renew grants annually, but they provide that long-term support to their partners to be able to engage meaningfully with them to drive sustainable impact. And this has also led to greater satisfaction and value for their own internal CSR teams. And as Shashank mentioned, moving to the next slide, Rachita. As Shashank mentioned, co-costs play a very important role in bringing efficiency and effectiveness in an NGO's operations and programs and their ability to achieve greater impact. And again, we've seen the example of Forbes Marshall, where they try to provide co-cost coverage based on program budgets of NGOs, but they actively engage with their NGO partners to really understand cost structures, understand their budgets, and allow them the flexibility to work within their funding based on what are their needs to deliver effective programs. And they've seen results from this where their NGO partners have been able to scale and deepen their impact without having to worry about meeting certain thresholds. Moving to the next slide. Thanks. There's increasing evidence also on how organizational development plays a catalytic role in driving an NGO's growth and creating resilience. And funders are investing in this both financially and non-financially by providing targeted funding support as well as access to knowledge, expertise, and resources based on identified needs of their NGO partners. And increasingly, funders are recognizing the importance of OD and trying to push the thinking of their NGO partners as well. And we've seen some pioneering initiatives in this space, such as the GROW Fund, which is a multi-stakeholder collaborative anchored by the Edelgift Foundation, where they provide dedicated OD grants to about 100 grassroots NGOs to strengthen their organization capabilities, as well as build more resilient and future-ready organizations. And we've also seen examples of non-financial support, where funders such as LGTVP are leveraging some of their fellows to provide capability strengthening to their NGOs over a 1-year period, based on the identified needs of their NGO partners. So I think something we wanted to emphasize here is that as funders, while you should really engage in conversations with your partners on investing in organizational development, the decision-making power should be left to your NGO partners, because we feel that they are the ones who can best understand where to invest this support effectively. So going forward, again, financial resilience is something that's extremely important. I think this came out mainly during the COVID pandemic, because it not only helps NGOs innovate and think long-term about programs, but really hedges them against any unforeseen risks. And in the current scenario, it becomes all the more important where we do see annual cash flow situations arise due to different regulations. So having reserves ensures that programs continue to operate without an income and NGOs continue to deliver impact. So as funders, we really need to reflect on if we are meaning to achieve sustainable impact, are we really helping drive the financial resilience of our NGO partners? And we've seen organizations such as Rohini Nilakini Philanthropies try to support their NGOs by providing direct grants, as well as keeping their unrestricted funding open for NGOs to be able to build their reserves. And this has really helped their NGOs achieve the impact at the scale that they envision and create a more stronger organization. And similarly, there is non-financial support also that organizations such as Marewala Health Initiative provide, where they provide a visibility in terms of the exit plans and also connect them to a new set of donors who can help build further revenue streams, ensuring that there's sustainability and resilience for these NGO partners. So moving forward, now we all know that effective philanthropy is one that helps to create strong and inclusive communities. And it really becomes critical to create an equitable society, because if inequality continues to increase, it can not only lead to adverse situations, but really undermine the potential of individuals and society as a whole. So it's important that we all take an explicit DEI lens so that we don't leave any segments of society behind in the progress that we're making. And we've also seen, and it's evident from a lot of research in the field, that when programs are created keeping the most marginalized communities in mind, they lead to larger social gains and create greater impact than what is envisaged. Hence, we really suggest that funders take an explicit DEI lens in programs, grant making, and monitoring and evaluation. And as you can see, there are multiple pathways that funders are doing that intentionally, whether it be defining the DEI objectives and vision, to really developing more community-driven solutions, working with proximate NGOs and leaders, as well as making their own grant-making processes more inclusive. In the case of Omidyar Network India, we do see that they have defined a DEI commitment at their organizational level, and they're also really intentionally supporting NGO partners to take an DEI lens within their programs, within their team composition, as well as champion this cause within other funder conversations that they have, to really ensure that they're creating wider and more holistic impact through their work. So these are some of the powerful examples that we came across through our engagement with funders on how they're trying to make their grant making more effective. And we realized that incremental change can go a long way in creating trust-based relationships to really achieve the greater social impact that we collectively envisage. So with that, I'll hand it back to Shashank.
Thanks, Aditi. And what we want to start with on the next slide is, again, a call to action for all of us. I think it's important for all of us, and especially doubly important for the funders, given the power dynamics, to reach out to understand whether the values that we hold dear, the philosophies that we hold dear in our grant making, are they manifesting in our practices? Are they manifesting in our policies? Have conversations with the NGO partners, have conversations with peer funders, and understand where we are right now. Reflect on what are the kind of policies that we can change to improve NGOs' effectiveness and the impact that they create. Engage with internal stakeholders to change practices, and refine by creating an action plan, by communicating the desire to change, not just to internal stakeholders, but to your NGO partners, and help your NGO partners come along in that journey to you. Continuously engage with them and incrementally continue to improve on the grant making policies and practices. And very importantly, apply a very intentional DEI lens right from your program design or thinking in terms of where we are going to create an impact, to how you choose, how you select your NGO partners or the communities that you choose to work with. At PWIT India, as a collaborative of now more than 6 partners, anchor partners, and 15 odd intermediaries and 25 odd nonprofits, we are committed to provide the right kind of information, data, and the tools that can help accelerate this journey. Next slide. So on the website, you can find information on how can NGOs plan organization development journey, a toolkit which has been developed by 6 leading intermediaries in India, including Bridgespan, a report on funder and NGO insights, evidence on how organization development helps nonprofits. This year, we are also going to be launching a compendium of effective grant making practices, which will showcase role models across different kind of funders, and also a true cost computation and communication guide, which will help nonprofits calculate their own cost and communicate them in a transparent manner to the funders. It's important for us to keep learning from the sector, from the peer group, see what has worked, what hasn't worked. And with that, I wanted to invite Preeta to introduce the panel of our like a power packed panel of funders who have been practicing some of these things for a long time now. Preeta, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shashank and Aditi. So we are really delighted to invite this panel to discuss this very important issue of building a stronger and more resilient sector. When we started the Pay What It Takes initiative, we of course knew anecdotally, intuitively, the extent of need for true cost funding in the sector. But what we didn't expect was the high degree of contradiction between funders and NGOs on what they think about paying what it takes. So over the last 2 years, when we surveyed almost 400 NGOs, 78 funders, plus interviewed over 100 stakeholders, what we found, and this was what made our jaws drop, is that 83% of these NGOs said that they struggle with indirect cost flexible funding. And 68, close to 70% of funders actually said they have flexible funding. On OD, 70% of the NGOs said they do not see funders giving them OD support, but 75% of the funders said that they do provide OD support. Similarly, about 74% of NGOs said they don't even have 3 months of operating reserves. And shockingly, Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi-led NGOs, although the data sample was, of course, small and directional, 70% of such NGOs said they don't have even 3 months of reserves. And there, I think only there was there resonance in what funders said, because only 9% of the funders said they could support financial resilience. So other than financial resilience, where NGOs and funders actually agreed on the gravity and magnitude of the issue, on everything else, whether it's multi-year partnerships, true cost funding, support for OD, there was such a vast discrepancy in what funders and NGOs thought. And when we surveyed everyone, I think a very key learning that we had was that NGOs and intermediaries like Dasra, Satwa, Bridgespan can talk to the skies, but really what can create mindset and practice change among funders, the most powerful tool is actually funder stories, peer influence and peer stories of what works for others who are in the same boat or boats that have actually sailed further along in that same ocean. And that really sparked our journey this year in the 3rd year of Pay What It Takes to build a compendium of funder practices. And whilst we will be filing about 15 to 20 funders this year, it will be an ongoing live journey reporting by us in the next year of the Pay What It Takes initiative as well. And I'm joined today by co-panelists Alok, who is the co-founder of Vidhi, Gayatri from ATECF, Reshma, who heads Ford Foundation, and Rati Forbes, both an individual philanthropist, but also providing leaderships to Forbes Marshall Foundation. I'm not going to take time to introduce these stalwarts because I'm sure every one of you know them really well. Their work, not just now, but over decades, bears testimony to the leaders that they are in the sector, not just overall, but the leadership they provide to this concept of true cost funding. So thank you so much, co-panelists, and we do hope over the next hour or so, we can really shine the light, not just on the need for it, which I think the presentation amply shows, but really how y'all, as Reshma, as representing Ford, a foreign foundation, but also wearing her previous hats where she was at Unilever Foundation and Tata Trust, bringing rich funder experience to the fore. Gayatri, who's really led at all fronts, an NGO, working with an intermediary and now leading A.D. Chandra Foundation, And Rati, of course, who's a household name in the sector, both as an individual philanthropist as well as leading the CSR work, can provide 3 different perspectives or examples of what they found useful, the results particularly they're finding, because a lot of funders are telling us, hey, this sounds great as a concept, but really, what is the ROI? Or what is, as yesterday, I think Rizwan Koita was saying on the panel at the live DPW, what is the P&L equivalent? And I know Reshma said that they are not just same metrics, but what are those markers of success, to borrow from yesterday's panel? And Alok, really, to represent the NGO sector at large. So Alok, you have a tall task to represent the whole range of NGOs that are really struggling with OD and true cost funding. So on that note, I will hand over first to Alok to maybe talk us through what do you see, as Vidhi, some of the challenges and experiences of OD. Did COVID affect that? So, what are the next 5 years looking like for Vidhi on this front? What are the lessons that you might want to share with other NGO counterparts and to funders? So over to you, Alok, to kick us off.
Thank you, Prita. And good afternoon good morning, a late good morning to everyone. I'd like to sort of start by saying that there is a little bit of survivorship bias in the way that I'm talking to you here. So the fact that we've been around for 10 years, the fact that I've been asked to sort of speak about this reflects a certain, the fact that Vidhi has been able to, at some level over the last few years, find funders, or rather the first step being identifying that organization development is an important element of the work that we do, find funders whose wavelengths match with us on this particular aspect, and actually put that into practice. So I will try and make use of the survivorship bias to share some of our experiences on this front, where we started and how we got here. Vidhi was started by a bunch of lawyers, and as much as we may pretend otherwise, we don't know anything outside the law. We don't know the first thing about how organizations are run, what it takes to build a sustainable institution. But we were very confident, perhaps slightly headstrong 20-year-olds who thought we knew what we were doing. But very soon, when we saw that our work had value, when our funders and our stakeholders and people in the sector saw that our work had value, we realized that this wasn't just, the pilot has worked, the pilot project has worked, and we need to build on this. But building on it is easier said than done. And that none of us came from a formal corporate background or even a government background, so to speak. We came from backgrounds where our experience of how an organization is structured and it works and the nuts and bolts of it, the plumbing of it, so to speak, we had no idea of. And it took us a while to get there. We had great guidance from our board, but guidance is not enough. It just kind of tells you the path. But you need the support from your funders, you need the support from your stakeholders who will say, yes, I understand why you need a full-time finance team, why you need a full-time HR team, why you need a proper analysis of the work that you do so that you can go ahead and plan your strategy. And the biggest barrier to me, very honestly, was in our own heads. It wasn't, you can't convince someone if you're not particularly convinced yourself. And for the longest time, and I have no difficulty admitting this, we did work on that poverty mindset. We did work on should we be asking for so much money? And when I say so much money, in our heads, 10 lakhs is an unimaginable amount. And we were like, should we be asking for so much money? And can we cut down on this? Can we cut down on that? What if they ask, why do we need this? What if they ask, why do we need that? How do we answer? It was those kinds of things which kind of inhibited us from even making that request, right? We understood we need these things, but we were like, maybe we'll settle for a junior person. Maybe we can't afford to pay this person so much. Maybe we should scrimp and save a little bit. Again, in our heads, this is how, we thought about it. This is how we were like, yeah, we need to be a little bit penny pinching. We need to have this scarcity mindset. Only then, we'll be able to get a go. But now I suppose, or having sort of been now having come through on the other side of understanding the importance of this kind of organization development work, now we are reframing how we are thinking. And I think my first big takeaway is that in this sector, it's the mindset which first, and within the NGOs, is the mindset which needs to be overcome. It's like if the vision, if what you're planning to do, how you plan to do it is definitely going to be necessary and important for the society and for the community. Everything else that needs to go to make it happen has to be considered part of that exercise. Just to give you one example of how we have changed our thinking on something, and this is also in the India Development Review. It came out a few weeks back. Those of you who want the longer version can read that. For the longest time, we're a research body, we're a research and advocacy body. And for us, communications was seen as a after the research part of it, right? When you need to go out and tell people. And we kind of realized more and more that the fundamental mistake was to see these two things as separate. To see that, yeah, we'll sit quietly in our offices, in libraries, and wherever, do our research, we will write nice reports, and then we will think of who will communicate it to, how we will communicate it to, who it will reach, and so on. But we realized the mistake was to see this as two separate things. They're actually part of the same thing. Your research, if it has to have impact in society, has to start from the point of view of who am I doing this for? Right? I'm not doing this to keep myself occupied. I'm doing this to see a real world impact somewhere. That real world impact may come from people changing their minds about a topic, all the way to the government saying, yes, this is important. We need to change the law on this point. That can only happen if you've clearly thought out how are we going to get this into the hands of the person whom we want to make the change, or the person whom we want to be the change. And this thinking of communications as fundamental to research, right? That first barrier we had to cross mentally to ourselves, to say we are not seeing this as some adjunct function, it is a fundamental to it. And from there follows the next aspect of it. It may seem trivial, but when you're drawing up that budget, when for us, we put personal costs and research costs and then overheads, that communications moved from overheads to research cost. It has to reflect also in a real way, because it's not enough for you to say, oh yeah, communication is now important. But if you're still going to keep putting it in that overhead cost we'll think about it later, you haven't fully processed it. So in a sense, this shift has to be reflected in a real way. And once you get why you're doing this, it'll be easier to convince the funders. And to our luck, or maybe because we were blessed that way, we did have a pool of funders who understood this, who understood that, yes, things like communications, things like finance, things like HR, these are all fundamental and essential to what Didi does. These aren't some afterthoughts. These aren't something that are just expenses which you need to find ways to scrimp and save on, which ensures that whatever you're trying to do has impact. Because at the end of the day, that's really what we're doing. The money isn't just an end in itself. The work isn't the end in itself. It is towards having that impact in whatever area of the NGOs. Finally, I want to leave and hand over to the others with one other point. And I think this has to do with some of the changing dynamics in the country and in the larger economy and society that we see. Not-for-profits are going to be competing with corporates for talent. There is no two ways about it. It is not an acceptable thing to say that we'll make do with less than the best talent because it's all we can afford to pay them. Or to tell top talent, you should take this personal hit in your finances, your well-being, and all of this, because this work is so good and so amazing, so valuable for society. I think this is again the larger mindset that is somehow there, that corporate functioning means for profit and NGO functioning means you learn to do with every day whatever you have. I think that is unfair, because the current generation and next generation of people who want to start NGOs are highly motivated people, people who know what they're giving up. They're okay with giving up some of it. What they would not like to be treated as is, you just don't feel like being treated as cheap labor, right? If this work is really valuable, right? If we are saying that promoting inclusivity, promoting equity, promoting fairness in the society is so important, why aren't we getting the best and brightest in this country to do it? Why are we not pitching it to the best and brightest to say that, listen, we'll take care of your needs, right? Obviously, you won't buy a Benz or whatever, but we will take care of your needs to make sure you live a comfortable life in whichever part of the country you're choosing to live. But we wanted to work on this because you're the best and the brightest. It's not people who can only afford to apply for a job like this. So people have nothing else but to apply for a job like this. And organization development, all of this feeds into it. When you give people that certainty that you're not here for 1-2 years trying to see what you can do with your life before doing something else, when you see this as an important career and you see your work as shaping the community, you want to feel valued by the funder that way. You want to feel valued by the institution that way. And all of this, and at least for us, and that's been our experience, when people feel that, I mean, you can hustle, of course, to an extent, but you don't want your daily life to be a hustle. You don't want to have to keep solving the organization's problems and whatever societal problems that you're addressing. So the larger point, I suppose, and this is something which funders will have to sort of think about, is you're not paying for the less than the best and the brightest to come and work in this field because it makes you feel good. You are paying for the best and the brightest to make a conscious choice that working in the interest of the community, working in the interest of society is actually something that I would rather do. And I feel valued for having done. So on those two broad points, I'll hand it over to the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Alok. I think that was like total nuggets of wisdom born out of action. And thank you for your candor also in sharing how your mindset shifted from penny pinching, as you called it, to one of necessity and abundance based. And yes, I mean, we do understand that, this sector cannot just survive on love and air, or that it's just a retirement home or an entry pad to get into good US business schools. I think all of those mindsets need to be broken if we have to really thrive in this sector. On this note, I'll hand over maybe first to Gayatri to kick us off on the funder side, Gayatri, as ATCF, which is championing this cause for many, many years. What are some of the pay what it takes principles that you all are living by? And if you could also talk a little bit about how you see that through line to achieving your own goals. So not any externally imposed goals, but how have those investments helped towards achieving the impact the way you all see it? I think that would be very helpful. And in parallel, I request Larry to repaste the 5 principles in the chat window, since I see we have almost 225 participants. So many have joined as the panel has started. Thank you for attending, everyone.
Thanks, Preeta. So I think in the very early days, I'm saying even before the foundation was formally set up, when our founders, Amit and Archana, were thinking about giving out and were giving, they often asked, what is it that other funders are not funding? And we'll fund that. If you look at the data, very often and most often, in fact, it was all non-programmatic needs. We have a staff retreat, we have a training need, we have, fundraising is a huge challenge. So can you help us build that muscle? And I think that understanding from NGOs and really knowing what they need to be able to grow and get better helped us formalize with Brisbane, in fact, a cohort of NGOs where we only are supporting their non-programmatic needs. So we look at fundraising, their strategy needs, their communications, what have you, in order to build those organizations as lasting, sustainable, strong organizations that can further impact in the sector. So when you talk about what is our goal as a foundation, our focus really is how do you increase impact in the social sector through strengthening the players in them. So if you look at strengthening an NGO, of course, as a funder, you're tempted to give programmatic costs, but that's not long-term sustainable. A pandemic hits and suddenly they don't have money to pay salaries. Suddenly, the fundraising person is told, actually, I don't know how to pay you because all my funders are now only paying for program costs. Whereas your fundraising person is the one who's going to be getting you that money. So it's a bit messed up. So we have this dedicated cohort of NGOs where we are only focusing, and I think we lost Preeta, but I'll continue, where we're only focusing on building their organizational strengths. Vidhi is one of those wonderful organizations we work with. And what we've been able to see is that data coming out of it is showing that they are actually able to make larger programmatic gains. So one of the NGOs, in fact, I won't name them because I didn't ask them, but 2 days ago, we had a meeting with them, and the founder of that NGO was telling us that 3 years ago, their budgets had peaked at about 4 crores and it stayed there. Last year, it became 7 crores. Next year's budget is 16.8 crores. And the reason that this has happened is we really help them build their communications muscle. Again, I'm not taking credit for it. It's 90% of the credit, I would say, goes to the NGO. But we were able to help them build that communications muscle, which has enabled them to make more NGO and government partnerships. As a result, they're now going to be in 25 districts. So their program, of course, is strong, and therefore they're able to do that. But without that communications muscle, how do you actually make that kind of a jump? What we're trying to do also is understand, therefore, what are those points or those triggers that are helping them grow, collecting that data and analyzing it so that we can put it out there for more funders to see, and actually help funders also see that, okay, there is data that's backing what these guys are claiming. I think it's also important, for us to understand that until now, a lot of NGOs, and I'm putting my previous life hat on as an NGO leader, most of the funding for non-programmatic needs came from foreign funders. They just seem to get it. Like we would tell them, just not able to pay for XYZ, and they'll say, we'll pay for it. Given the changes in the regulation, it's imperative for Indian funders to step up and play that role of understanding what is it that our NGOs need to grow and being able to provide the funding, the expertise that we can pay for and they can use, bringing in, strengthening the intermediary network to support these NGOs, but just ensuring that they don't have to, as Alok said, scrimp, pay somebody less, or I've even done it where as a CEO of the organization, you don't take a salary because you want to spend on something else. So not healthy practices. And therefore, as Indian funders, how do we step in and ensure that our NGOs are able to continue making deep and long-term impact? I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thanks, Gayatri. While Preeta tries to figure out her internet issues, I wanted to bring in Rati here. I think Gayatri emphasized the need for the Indian funders, domestic funders, to see this as a vital issue. And I think, Rati, there can't be anyone better than you to talk about your journey and Forbes Marshall's journey. Because as a CSR organization as well, Forbes Marshall has adopted a number of practices which are inspiring. And sorry, Preeta, back to you. I was just asking Rati to.
Thank you, Shashank and Preeta. First, pleasure to be here. Let me first say that when I first read the Bridgespan report on PWIT, it was a no-brainer for us to become a supporter of the work that Bridgespan is doing, because somewhere we had practiced this, but possibly not really realizing the importance of what we had been doing all these years. And as you rightly said, the journey evolves. As you work more with organizations, within communities, etc., you understand the importance of the 5 principles that are very well articulated in the PWIT report. So I think that was really the catalyst to get us also to think about this in a more structured fashion. So thanks to Bridgespan first. Taking each of the 5 principles, I want to say that we have always actually adopted a multi-year partnership in whatever we do. I would say 95% of the grants that we give are in that. In fact, that 5% outlier is only because possibly it was a one-off kind of an initiative, or it was a one-year initiative or whatever. The second one around the OD needs of NGOs, again, to my mind, it was really a no-brainer. I'll just quickly say that one of the we have sort of 4 tenets or approaches that we use with all our funding. One is that we give like almost additional points if one is adopting a collaborative approach. And so that fitted in very well. We have a trust-based M&E system. It is something that is developed either along with the organization we are grant making to, but we do not have a very structured template which they have to fill up with 5 pages long M&Es, because we really believe trust needs to be at the heart of whatever partnership we forge with whichever organization. We tend to support innovative pilots, even within very, very large organizations, which we have supported. We try and support an innovative pilot. And coming back to the OD needs of the NGOs, what we have done in practice, and I will just say that for other funders and grant makers, which has worked well, is that when we begin grant making, we try and understand from the outset what are the needs of that NGO that are not, or NGO or organization, very much like Gayatri said, which is not being covered by other funders. So we in fact go ahead and ask them what is something that others will not fund, and more often than not, it's really a small relatively small issue to our grant. It's, communication. It's around, we need one HR person because now our team has grown. We are spreading to a new city. We need somebody to be embedded over there, and so on. And I'll give a few details later. So basically, a small percentage of our total grant is earmarked towards understanding what the NGO needs. And this is completely unrestricted, but it's more often, I would say in possibly 99% of the cases, it's an OD need. And then finally, the third principle which really resonated was the focus on underserved and marginalized communities. We do this from our foundation, the company foundation, and also, of course, personally. There are so many good we grappled initially with finding these organizations. How do you begin to scan them? How do you know they're credible, and so on? And we found one way of starting, and this is just a suggestion to others on this call. I think somebody mentioned the Grow Fund of Edelgive, which has already done a lot of due diligence of these organizations that they have onboarded. Similarly, the Rebuild India Fund of Dasra is another fund which is particularly focusing on small organizations working in with very marginalized communities, where it's local leadership in most, if not all cases, and serving the most underserved of our country. And I do believe that local funders like us, domestic funders, have to support these organizations which do not have FCRA, etc. If we don't step up and do it, then who is going to do it? A large institutional and other, large foundations which have to insist on FCRA cannot fund. So we need to step up and fund these organizations. And finally, I would say the financial resilience piece of the PWIT principle resonated very, very strongly with me always. As we know, again, from our corporates and from CSR, we cannot support corpus funding, but I think some of us individually need to support corpus, because otherwise how will organizations even begin? And this corpus fund, or whether you want it unrestricted to a pilot organization or a pilot innovation, is absolutely a must again. I will just say, I think Shashank, you and Preeta, you asked, how has this really helped us in our journey to evolve? I think following these principles sort of inadvertently, let me be honest, at the beginning, has made us realize, and as we developed a very robust theory of change and the very focused verticals we will continue to work on going forward, at least for the next 5 years. Our two verticals are what we call ecosystem strengthening or resilience of the social sector. And the second one is community empowerment. And we feel that from the vertical of community empowerment, we have really learned the very important part of strengthening our social sector. So I'll just stop there and hand back to Preeta.
Thank you so much, Rati. I think you really brought to life your work and policies across the principles. So I do hope that resonates with a lot of the funders in the audience, and frankly, even the NGOs in this audience, because when you all communicate with funders, as Alok said, it's important to not feel constrained or shy to ask for this, because unless you ask, there's not going to be money coming towards those causes. Reshma, we'd love you to share two sets of experiences. One, of course, your own evolution as a funder across 3 large organizations, any learnings you have on the multiple pathways for these principles. And then, of course, Fort Build, which is now very well known and has a very structured approach to OD, if there are any lessons and the benefits you all see as a foundation, would be very helpful.
Thanks, Pritha. So I actually want to start with a little anecdote. When I was, listening to Alok, I had made my transition from the private sector to work for a nonprofit. And I remember, I think in my first or second month, I went with a spreadsheet to my boss and I asked him, where are the hidden zeros? And he said, there are no hidden zeros. So I actually looked at him in utter shock, saying, really, you expect, us to do all this with just, this much, with large, sets of the budget line items absolutely blank. And at that time, there might have been some, youthful heroism in trying to conquer all with very, very sparse means. But it was also very evident that, that the tank has to be filled up at some point in time. And I think it was actually an extremely important experience that also shaped my journey, because I realized that, just even on the, I've done fundraising as well, the hesitancy to actually ask for what was imperative for the institution to do well was very widespread. We just felt that we can overcompensate with more hours of work, more valor, more creativity, more ingenuity, more what have you. And you realize that it goes, a certain distance and then not so much. And I think that experience is perhaps something that has always, stayed with me across, 3 institutions, the Tata Trust, Corporate Foundation, and now at Ford, which has always been to ask organizations, are you asking for enough? Will this be sufficient for you to meet the goals that you're committing to? And that question used to often be met with complete stunned silence. But I have to say that, this has become better over the years. Even I think when we were, even for a corporate foundation, I think it was very evident that if you're trying to work on difficult challenges, for example, water and issues that actually have a long-term horizon, the duration of support that you give to organizations and the way you look at their capabilities cannot be from a short-term lens. So I'm actually quite delighted that, even within, let's say, a large corporate where, quarterly results, typically would define your, your existence, there was a very clear appetite that the board demonstrated that we're in this for the long haul, and therefore the commitments that we would make are multi-year commitments. We will make sure that our teams are adequately resourced, and more importantly, we will encourage organizations to work in partnerships hardwired from the get-go and not to be discovered along the way, right? So there were some of these principles that were really embedded from an understanding that if you're trying to address difficult long-haul issues, your funding support cannot only be programmatic and cannot be for a short duration. And one would argue this is fairly commonsensical, but it is extremely hard to build a convincing case, as Pritha, you're discovering as well. And, and it was really interesting to have moved from there to actually have seen a program like BUILD. And so just for everyone's benefit, BUILD was a program that was initiated in 2016-17 by the foundation globally, supporting over 300 organizations with the intent to put grantees in the driver's seat. And I will qualify what that means, because I think that we tend to get stuck in binaries, when it comes to trust-based giving. There was a very clear method to it, but the intent really was, how do you ensure that organizations can be creative, adaptive, and more importantly, collaborative in the sectors that they're working in. The presentation, talked about 83% organizations actually demonstrating that in 2021, which was the year after COVID, 83% of organizations that received BUILD grants, and this includes organizations in the Global South, very clearly said they were more resilient financially than they were before. Nearly all of them said that this had resulted in significant institutional strengthening, which, no surprises, had a dramatic impact on their programmatic results. And what is interesting, when we say that you put the grantees in the driver's seat, they define their priorities, whether it was in terms of, growth, financial growth, whether it was in terms of, stabilizing leadership, strengthening governance, building a communications muscle, building strong professional HR systems, even in terms of refining strategy. The grantees fundamentally defined what they believed was integral to ensuring that they were prepared for the next 5 to 7 years. And I think it's interesting when we heard back from grantees, the response for what Bill did for them was, there was a grant that enabled them, and gave them the permission to strengthen. It gave them the headspace to think. It gave them the room to plan, the bandwidth to execute, and also the space to fail, right? So all of this is what, a grant which had a term to it and a method to it as well. And I think fundamentally a spirit, which is one of trust and believing that the grantees actually know what is, essential for them. So I think this ensured over a period of time that these principles are no longer just restricted to the 300 organizations that were Bill recipients, but it actually defines, the way we look at grant making. And it's really understanding what's going to create resilient and effective institutions. It is about addressing the elephant in the room, which is the power dynamics between funders and grantees. And therefore, when we say put the grantees in the driver's seat, that itself requires a fair bit of hand-holding on the funders side, right? Because it is a new experience on both hands. But I think what has been remarkable is how deeply engaged the process can be. It can be frustrating, but it's a lot of fun as well. And more importantly, it actually builds a lot of joint ownership on outcomes. And this is really what breaks down that power dynamic, right? It's not like you didn't do your job. It's like we're in this together. And the policy that we create together would be of these organizations that will outlive our term and tenure in our respective institutions as well. So I think that's really been the journey so far, and we're still learning continuously from our build experiences. And like I said, it's extremely method driven, right? So organizations typically take a full year to do their assessments, right? In terms of what are their specific organizational strengthening requirements, how do they want to utilize this grant, what would be their markers of success, how do they then want to deploy it for the next 4 years. If the dynamics shift or if the context changes, how do they want to, adapt the support to be able to meet a changing context as well? So I think, again, it is about giving up control, but actually having shared responsibility. And I think that's an interesting space to be as funders as well as, grantee partners. And it's a very early start, I think, to this process, but we're fairly heartened to hear what support like this has done. I think there is a challenge when we say, when we said what is going to take for other funders, the moment you talk about unrestricted, unrestricted is perhaps, qualified as unregulated, but actually it has a very clear method to, defining how you want to use resources which would serve the mission that the organization has actually taken on.
Yeah, very, very true, Arishma. That really resonates. And I would say, I would maybe stretch that last powerful line you ended with to say people misinterpret not just unrestricted as unregulated, but unaccountable or unaccounted, which is also a fallacy, because even unrestricted grants actually, like you said, unleashes far more power of impact, not just mind space, but what that can be done as well. So that's a nice segue to come back to you, Alok, after having heard all the different types of funders, to say what really has it unleashed for you. I know you spoke about shifting your mindset to then ask for this money, having luckily, as you said, a group of supportive funders who gave you that flexible or trust-based funding. So can you share a little bit about, I know we have about 20 minutes more, so maybe one round of questions more, but if you could just share how you deployed that funding that can inform other NGOs, and what benefits did you see as Vidhi?
So what we sort of saw, and I think I'll go back to the example that I talked about in the context of communications. So it's our number one bugbear because we were in the public eye. We just didn't know how to communicate our work to the public, to the government, to whomever we needed to ensure that our work has impact. And I think what we are seeing, I sort of see three very tangible outcomes in the work that we're doing. Number one, and I think this is purely internal. Number one has been to get our researchers, who are again coming from the fields mostly of law, but also from academic research, to think about communication and dissemination of their research. Because this is something which you may call it upskilling, or you may sort of call it whatever, but the way in which you undertake the research, the kind of topics you pick up, the kind of plans you make to ensure that there is impact, that has ensured that has sort of filtered into the ranks, so to speak, and people sort of think a little bit more before they say, I want to do this. The second thing that it has done, and I think this is a little bit more external, has been to make us far more visible. We aren't constantly worrying, and we just had a board meeting where one of our board members asked, the last 6 months I've been seeing Vidhi's name and for a lot of positive things. I was there like a conscious effort at it, and I was like, yes. We were like, yes, this is exactly what comes out of it, right? Because if you pick, and again, those of you who have the time afterwards, you can just sort of see the width and range of our work, right? Everything from looking at data and presenting the data on the POCSO legislation, all the way up to detailed thought out videos on education of children, inclusive education, to how to make, our apps, the apps that we use, accessible to persons with disability. The width and range of our work becomes immediately evident and in such different formats. Just the three pieces of work that I talked about. One is very data heavy. One, you'll see a lot of charts, one you'll see a lot of numbers. You will see something to show how rigorous the in-depth work was. The second is more conversation. The second are videos and podcasts and things which will make it effective. And the third is actionable features for people to implement in the way they develop these apps. So we are reaching very different stakeholders. We are doing very different kinds of work, and we have found very different ways of getting our work to the right people to ensure impact. And of course, it remains that there are, of course, still challenges for us to overcome in terms of how do we take it to specific targeted audiences? How do we take it to an even wider audience? If we had to sort of say communicate to half the country, how do we do it? Those are still there. The third, I think, tangible impact, and this I say from a more personal perspective, those of us on the leadership team, we sort of now reframe our work. We are not thinking of ourselves as working on something. We are working towards something, right? The impact aspect of it has become very central to the way in which we define our work itself. And we realize that if we are working towards something, it can't depend on 3 or 4 or 15 or even 40 people doing the same thing. And in the hope of success, you have to build an institution. You have to build an institution, you have to build an organization. And for us, it has been eye-opening to sort of see the enormous amount of work and expertise and research which goes into taking all of this, which we had taken for granted. Somebody will figure it out and somebody will do it at some point of time. But to really have the impact that you're looking to do, to have that long lasting, and I think it was Reshma who sort of said this, I'm sorry if I'm confusing. I think it was Reshma who said this, that this will be things which will outlive us. This will be things that will continue to have impact year on year, compounding over year on year, long after we cease to be involved with it. And that will be the most signal contribution that you can make. It's not just about the fact, if I have to take my person, it's not just about the fact that Alok was in Vidhi for 10, 15 years, but Alok was in Vidhi for 10, 15 years and ensured that it survived the next 20 years. That is how, at least we have realized that our work cannot just depend on some of us being here all the time to do it, but we need to bring in more people to ensure that this change is more visible for a lot of people. And we sort of see this organization development as not just something we have to do on the side while we are doing our work, but it is something that is essential and core to our work. It is what ensures that the work that we are doing has that long-lasting impact and goes beyond just the abilities of individuals.
Yeah. Thank you, Alok. And I would second that. I think as NGOs build out whatever you call it, a business plan or a social impact plan, please do look at not just your programmatic planning, but what is the kind of organization you need to deliver that plan. Because a strategy exercise without understanding what's your organization, governance, operating model, and financing really cannot get implemented. So I would totally second Alok's wisdom that he shared. Rati, coming back to you, as we do this final round with the three of the funders, would love to hear, was there any light bulb moment? I know you said a lot of this was unintentional, maybe of philosophy itself, but either as you went through this journey, like anything that made you evolve to do things better on these principles? And if you could just keep an eye out to, as other funders in this virtual audience are listening, and like what might they do differently to change some of their practices if they're not following these 5 practices today?
Thanks, Preeta. I think possibly I would talk about 3 principles that have been not just one light bulb moment. I think one is very, very crucially and importantly in a partnership, really having the real value of, you need to have shared values. I think that was brought out when you all first spoke. What does that really mean? You can't have this funder donor relationship with the organization. We really need to forge true partnerships. And I think somewhere that sometimes is missing. And personally, I find that the best way is just listening a lot to the partner organization, really understanding their pain points, what's going well for them, just like one would do with any partnership. Why do we continue to have this I'm your donor, I know what's best for you kind of an approach and attitude? So I would say that would be my number one learning, which keeps getting reinforced, honestly, month on month. I also think that all our team really asks again this question of what are others not supporting you for? People are supporting you for programmatic stuff, activities, etc. But what are they not supporting you for? And we find some really useful data coming out or content coming out. For example, we support a research vertical of 2 education-based organizations. They're well known, but no funder wants to support research. And I do think there's a dearth of good data to use to build upon in our country. We also have we also have fellowships which we offer. I think you mentioned Atma. We offer fellowships to Toolbox, to Tech for Good, etc. And supporting the entire cohort, for example, of Tech for Good. And then I think the third one is really, I've understood the power of also non-financial offerings. We keep thinking that it's only money that is important to the organization we are partnering with, but I really believe it's not. We have seen some huge wins by just helping to open a couple of doors, helping to find, we know in the ecosystem who sort of anecdotally supports what. So networking opportunities, just keeping them, in very transparent communication and info sharing. One challenge is sometimes organizations and smaller organizations' inability to absorb large grants. And that has made me and our team understand even more the importance of trust-based, unrestricted funding, as well as supportive mechanisms for capacity building for them.
Great. No, thank you so much, Rati. Actually, on that note of her saying opening doors and networking, Rati and her teams at Fort Marshall were instrumental in this initiative, doing its first funder circle, focused on Pune-based and some Mumbai-based funders. So if any funders in this audience want to learn more, we are rolling out learning circles across the country as we speak, some virtual and as logistics permit in person. So if you'd like to learn more, double click to understand what can be done better through this initiative, please do write into us. We'd love to have you all as part of the funder learning circles. On that note, I'll come back to you, Reshma. Any tips that you have or where you also evolved as a funder that you think other funders can learn from, your journey, both personal and institutional in this regard?
That's a subject for a book, Pritha.
We look forward to the book. Maybe you can provide us the summary version.
I think the first thing is for us as funders to be actually a little mindful of our blind spots as well. It's I've heard from our grantees several times, oh, but others don't give like you. And we would say, no, you're just, we actually never valued the lived experience of our grantees who have interfaced with a large number of funders, right? And actually, I sit back and think, what could we have done? I mean, the simplest thing for us to have done was to reach out to, the 20, 30 funders that our grantees had, who basically were giving us feedback saying, what you're doing may be all very well, but this is still the exception to our lived experience. So I also feel, and this to Rati's point, it's not just specific to the organization, the programmatic challenges that grantees are facing or organizations are facing, but also to hear them about what is their lived experience with funders across the spectrum. And then are we as a community ready to have those conversations with our peers? Because it's all very well for us to practice this within our institutions. But I think that if this is also going to be a movement of sorts in the sector, it is actually going to require us to commit spending, time and effort and energy in engaging and building this, confidence, case, trust, evidence, returns, whatever it takes to convince, our peers who, I think I'm drawing some really simple analogies about, how metrics will define and can sum up the substance of an entire institution, right? So I think that I feel is going to become extremely imperative, because the change really needs to be driven there. I think that organizations today are being extremely vocal about where they're struggling and where they're facing challenges. One of the key things that we asked, and this is, I think, to Alok's point, is that how can your org structure look exactly the same over 10 years, right? And so today you do need, as part of your organizational design, your compliance officer and your finance officer. I mean, these are core roles to the institution. They're no longer in the periphery. And therefore, it's very critical that you also start looking at the design of the organization, reflecting all of these that may have been seen as support roles literally at the core of the institution, because unless they're not strong, the programmatic work that you're doing will always, have challenges. So I think that, again, has been a very interesting insight from the institutional strengthening, diagnostics that we've undertaken, that this is, even with the diagnostic tool, it's an afterthought, right? So it's really, how do you bring all of this into the heart and center of, what will build a strong, resilient institution? And I think the last bit has also is again, with program managers, officers, people who have an interface with grantees, and how are we building and how are we hardwiring these roles for humility and partnership also is really important. And it's, again, this is a challenge that we have to perhaps be mindful of in organizations we lead, that this is not just for us to talk about, but this is also a value that needs to permeate downstream as well, so that every engagement or interaction that we have with our partners is one of peers. The other way also works out, right? So I remember having a conversation with one of our grantees a couple of years ago, and I said, aap tabhi phone karte hain jab fund disbursement hona hota hai, but we are peers. Why can't you just pick up the phone and have a conversation with me and say, Reshma, we're thinking of doing something, but we'd love to get your inputs. I said, you don't realize it's extremely lonely for me. I'm sitting here waiting for you to, make a request, right? And so again, it's really important to demonstrate how are we open, accessible, available, for our grantees. So I do think that it's as much, the shift is as much required amongst organizations as it is required by funders as well. And again, our task now is to evangelize, this amongst our peers and within our institutions as well, I'd say.
Yeah, thanks, Reshma. We've had many questions from the audience. I'm pulling this and first to you, Gayatri, on this one. So a lot of the questions are around both smaller NGOs, remotely located NGOs, some located in the Northeast, and similarly smaller intermediaries, professional services firms that could provide accounting or OD support, but are not the big ones that everybody in India might know of. How do you think those NGOs can be discovered, and those professional services firms can also be available to provide OD services to the sector? Anything that you think funders like yourselves who work on a spectrum of small, medium, and some larger NGOs can do, are doing? I know Grow Fund was already mentioned by Rati. So there are similar such funds, and we need many more grows and rebuilds for India, right? Like one grow, one rebuild just scratches the surface and gives an example. But other than that, which we did speak about, like any suggestions, Gayatri, on this question from the audience?
I think I've got the toughest questions. I don't have one straight answer. Like you said, Grow started last year, Rebuild this year or late last year. But I think it's the beginning. And there will be many more such funds coming out and focusing on different size of organizations. So Rebuild has very consciously looked at smaller organizations. Grow said, I think, above a certain amount. And we need to be out there looking out for more of these. And as funders, we need to be supporting more of these collaboratives, which we commit to doing. On the intermediary front, I think we have found there have been fantastic small individual intermediaries, some of them which have grown because of support from funders. But we are constantly on the lookout for them so that they can work with our NGOs. We don't mandate who our NGOs work with, but we say, here are 7 people who can support you on M&E. One such NGO we were working, who reached out to us for funding, we said, let me not fund you directly. We'll fund somebody to work with you because you really need help on your M&E and your fundraising support. So we brought Atma in, working with this NGO that's working in very remote locations in the hilly areas. And they were able to make them grow from, I think, 1.5 crore to about 8 crores in 2 years' time. So we are very consciously supporting both smaller intermediaries, but also in the hope that they will support smaller and more remote organizations who don't have access to large consulting firms or large partners that because they can't afford them. So I think that's something that we as funders need to do. I'm loving that the questions in the chat are all NGOs who understand this need. So about time we responded to that.
Yeah, thank you, Gayatri. I think I agree. One question to you, Reshma, again from the audience. It's a slightly broader question than we have actually, to be frank, touched on pay what it takes so far. But do you see a role for blended finance instruments in this space? Particularly, I think the member of the audience wants to, can it help improve resilience? And if I might extend that to build stronger NGOs, like what's your experience on role of blended finance as that slowly picks up from a small denominator, but growing in India?
So I think, again, when we look at blending any forms of capital, right, there is an inherent complexity that you inherit there, right? And whereas what we are trying to, demonstrate is the role for flexible, capital. So I think that there is a role for different funding instruments to play. If we're really talking about strengthening institutions, at their core, there may be a certain funding instrument that is far more, applicable. If organizations are actually very confident in terms of outcomes and therefore want to, invest in growth stage financing, then there could be blended, instruments that serve them better. So I think, again, it's very critical for organizations to, to determine where they are in their journey and what's the most appropriate funding instrument for them as well. There is no one size fits all, for sure. I think even, for example, our build experience, while it was deployed with a wide cross section of organizations, but it was very clear that absorption capacities varied, right? and the absorption pace varied across organizations. So it comes down to mapping the purpose of funding to, the purpose, that the organization is seeking financial support for. And therefore, if you're really looking at internal capabilities, internal processes, literally looking at the DNA of the institution and strengthening that, what's the most appropriate capital form for you to deploy there?
Great. Thank you. Maybe just a 1 minute rapid roundup. If you had to say one word or one phrase, each of you, for where you see the future of, a stronger, more resilient sector for India. It could be a message of hope, message of, discovery for future work for all of y'all. But would love to have one word or phrase from each of you. And then I would request the audience to please stay on. We'll have a very short feedback poll by Dasra. The reason I'm requesting this is that we as Britspan actually use that poll information as we process how y'all had benefits of this session to structure future sessions. So we will take this feedback very seriously as we program. It's not just a tick in the box at all for us. So I would request you all to stay literally 30 seconds to fill it out, but a quick round robin. I'll look back to you. A word or phrase for where you see the future in India.
I'd say it has to be ambition. Because I think you are going to have, look, there are people who are currently going to the startup sector because they want to disrupt whole sectors of the industry.
Yeah.
Those people should be attracted to our sector. Their ambition should be funded. Their ambition should be promoted because that ambition is a good change. If you think about it at the end of the day, you don't want someone to do as much as little as possible. You want them to have the ambition to make a better country.
Thank you. One word or phrase from the others. Rati, do you want to go next?
A stronger voiced social sector, and hopefully getting stronger and stronger each year.
Thank you. Reshma?
I would say breakthrough. I think we've been caught in a cycle for a long time, and breaking through and breaking out of traditional traditional beliefs, traditional methods, traditional assumptions, and really combining that with the ambition that we have for ourselves in terms of the work that we do. So really moving from incremental to breakthroughs is what I'd like to leave it with.
And Gayatri, saving the best for the last.
No pressure. I would say collaborative impact. I think we want to move the needle, then funders, government, the nonprofit sector need to come together. Government gives you scale, NGOs give you the depth and impact and the voice from the ground. And we as funders have to make it happen.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think ambition, strong voice, collaborative impact, all for breakthroughs. I think it's going to be our guiding principles as well as we look at pay what it takes. I know we are at time, so very quickly for the feedback poll, many, many thanks to my co-panelists for your candor and inspiration to have shared your thoughts and journeys. If the audience could please fill this out, and panelists feel free to fill this out as well.
Thanks, Pratha. Thank you. Thanks. And Shashank, thank you for anchoring this.
Thank you, Preeta and Shashank, and all the Britspan team. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm just going to say ditto.